So I'm just out doing a round of feeding today, and so I've got some pretty fat protein patties with me, and thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about one of the more common problems that I hear being brought up online. Like a lot of beekeepers that make their own patties, smaller beekeepers, not even so much smaller beekeepers, but it just seems to be a bit of a common problem for people that are trying to make their own protein patty, either buying something off the shelf and then mixing it up, whatever. But there's a lot of advantages to putting a larger patty on. Like I feed 2 pounds, 2 1/4 at a time at the key junctures, key times a year when I want to ensure that there's no protein stress going on in my hives. So one of the problems that you run into when you're putting on bigger patties like that, not all the time, but in a lot of cases, is that depending on the protein sources and other ingredients in your patty, a lot of the patties can stiffen up and become just like a rock. So you end up being forced to feed little small patties at a time, and that really doesn't create, like with protein, like there's a dose response curve to it in the beehive. So in general terms here, like without oversimplifying, the process of forcing the queen's egg laying rate to either continue at a higher rate or to stimulate that, she needs to be fed. So you need a carbohydrate source coming in that you simulate a flow by putting feeders on top or some open feeders. That's pretty easy to do. It's not rocket science. With the protein, like if they're not eating a lot of the protein, like so for whatever reason they're not attracted to the patty and the nurse bees are just nibbling away at the patty, that really isn't going to create the response that you want. If you ever thrown a patty on and you go back in a week or so later and you pull the remainder of the patty off, it's hardly been touched, and you pull a few frames of brood out from underneath of it, and you're sorely disappointed that you don't see any eggs or larvae being laid as a response to the money that you just invested in the patty. Well, there's a lot of factors that go into that for sure. And again, I'm speaking in very oversimplified terms, but one of the major factors there is consumption rate. Because again, with protein consumption in a hive, there is a dose response curve. There's a dose response curve in terms of getting that queen to do what you want it to do, and that's a direct. Getting her to do what you want her to do is a direct result of how much feed the nurse bees are consuming. So if you put a patty on and they're just nibbling away at it, what you're not going to have happen is those glands of those nurse bees are not going to be stimulated by just little tiny bits of food coming in. And if their glands aren't stimulated and they're not producing a lot of jelly, then the queen isn't going to be fed any more than what she was prior to you putting that patty on. What you want from a patty is you want to drop it on and you want to see an immediate bees on top of it. They're just devouring it. If your objective is brood production, and I assume if you're putting patties on, that's what you're going for. You put a patty on and they just devour that patty. Like the response, the physiological response to that by the nurse bees is that their glands are immediately going to start to swell up. Their glands are going to start producing more jelly. And those glands get swollen up with jelly, they dump it. They dump that jelly, and they dump that jelly by feeding the worker larva, but they also dump that jelly by feeding the queen. And the more that queen is fed, the more eggs, the higher her egg laying rate is going to be, or the more it'll be sustained. This time of year is key. We've got a little, blast of time here, a little short window of time where we need to simulate a nectar flow and throw these patties on. If they're not eating the patties fast, you're not going to see the same dose response curve. So there needs to be enough protein, and they need to be on it hard to get the result that you want. Those are just some of my own observations. Right, wrong, or indifferent. But you want enough on there, and they need to eat it fast, and that will produce the result that you're looking for. So how do you get them to eat it fast? Well, I'm not going to give all of my secrets away here, but one of the most practical things that any beekeeper can employ is making sure that the moisture content is right in the patty and that it doesn't harden up on you. So how do you keep it from hardening up? Well, the most off-the-shelf option is high fructose corn syrup, and that works really well to keeping a patty moist. The problem is the problem that I run into is that that's not available in my area unless I want to buy a tanker truck full of it, and I don't mix that much protein up at a time. You know, I run anywhere between 90 and 110, 120 hives, and I'm probably going to drop that back down a little bit here, depending on what my work schedule does. So I don't need, I don't need tanker trucks full of product at a time. So out of necessity, I figured out a little trick here that I'll share with you. So it doesn't necessarily need to be high fructose syrup to have that hygroscopic property to it. You can also make high glucose. So if you just take normal sugar syrup, mix it up 2 to 1, heat it up. So that's basically you're creating an inversion process there. So you're splitting the covalent bonds of those two molecules, fructose and glucose, and they're breaking apart, and then you end up with glucose and fructose, so you no longer have sucrose. There's some left over, but that's the process of basically breaking that molecule apart and ending up with your individual sugar molecules. That will still harden up. It lasts a little bit longer than just in solution sugar syrup, but it still hardens up. So the trick is to go to anywhere where you can buy bulk foods. Bulk Barn was what I was trying to spit out there, is where I buy mine. And you go and you can either buy dextrose is what I buy, and that's just glucose. That's just glucose powder. So I heat that syrup up. You can add a little bit of apple cider vinegar, or just table vinegar, or whatever you want, and that acid lowering the pH kind of accelerates that process of breaking those covalent bonds, and it assists the inversion process. So you can add a little bit of vinegar there if you want. It's not really important. What's important is the ratios of the sugar molecules in the final product. So you split those molecules up, you just heat it up, bring it to a quick boil, simmer it, and then you take your glucose powder, and by weight, so however much sugar by weight you added, you take 25% of your glucose powder or dextrose, and you add that to the mix and let that dissolve. And again, bring it to a heat. And then the ratios are such that it will not harden. It maintains those hygroscopic properties, and that keeps a nice 2-pound patty. Like, the texture is just perfect, and it stays that way indefinitely. Really good little mix that anybody can do at home to keep their patties moist, help you with your consumption rates. And yeah, it's worked for me. And again, it was kind of out of necessity that I figured that little trick out, because I can't get high fructose corn syrup in my area without buying way more of it than I need. So hopefully you'll find some value in that little tip.